By 1960, the War of the Worlds was over half a century years old, an iconic story that had been illustrated multiple times, and yet across that gulf of time, artists still had much more to offer in visually bringing this story to life, as was evident by the Gorey Tripods of horror. Edward Gorey was born in Chicago and began a career in art, working at the art department of the Doubleday Anchor Publishing Company from 1953. He'd spend nearly a decade working in this capacity, creating covers and interior illustrations for books totaling over 200 book covers, including such classics as Bram Stoker's Dracula and T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, on which the Broadway musical Cats was based, indicating that clearly he was just a master at illustrating utterly horrific things. He'd develop a very unique style, often depicting unsettling scenes filled somehow simultaneously with dour dread and fantastical whimsy, perfectly fit to and would often portray scenes in Victorian or Edwardian settings. Gorey was not restricted to simply doing the art of other people's books, however, and would actually release books of his own. With this, he experimented heavily, creating very unusual work, such as books that were literally matchbox-sized, pop-up books, books entirely populated by inanimate objects, and the list goes on. Even in this capacity, in the concept of what a book was, he was attempting to be artistic. His 1958 picture book, The Object Lesson, named after a Victorian teaching method, earned serious critical respect, with him developing a reputation as a Gothic surrealist artist, which almost feels like it was inevitable with a name like Gorey. What all of this shows is that he was clearly perfectly suited when he was asked towards the end of his time at Doubleday to create the wraparound cover and chapter heading illustrations of the War of the Worlds in a new special edition for the legendary Looking Glass Library, of which he was a founder. Published in 1960 under the New York Review of Books Classics imprint, the pieces of artwork done by Gorey here are prime examples of his Gothic surrealist style, exemplified in particular by his portrayal of the iconic tripods of the story. He really delves into the horror aspect of the War of the Worlds, probably more so than any other artist, creating perhaps the creepiest depiction of the fighting machines that's ever been done. And that's saying something, considering some of the previous versions are really quite ominous and insidious. They are most clearly shown on the wraparound cover Gorey did for the book, which is naturally the only one of the pictures that's in colour, albeit for the fighting machines, which stand out clearly in their practically grayscale livery, creating a very stark image. Gorey portrays them as being really creepy insect-like entities, almost made up except for its dish-like head, entirely of gorgon groups of tentacles, matching in its seeming biologicalness with the Martian creatures themselves. One comment on Reddit described them as dinner plates with spider legs and octopus arms, which is a pretty good description, I guess. They kinda look like giant land-faring jellyfish to me. But this mishmash serves up what are really quite terrifying contraptions with great power and ability. For one thing, they are blatantly tremendously flexible. Gorey's done such a superb job of making it so easy to imagine how these machines move, striding over these hills with ease in a manner like giant spiders, with many tentacles flailing about. He really emphasises the utterly biotic nature of these entities, showing how advanced these creations by the Martians are, to have built something so obviously mechanical, yet like living beings. This is emphasised by the fact that, although most depictions have tentacles, these ones also use what are effectively tentacles as their legs as well. Some of the images of them, you could almost have trouble deciphering what parts are the legs and which are the arms with the way they intermingle with each other, somehow seeming so messy, yet precise in their movement. This uniformity in design of their appendages culminates with its smooth head, creating such an organically advanced look that's utterly alien and incomparable to anything humans have created, even now I think in the modern era. Their heads are highlighted by two relatively small beady button-like eyes, which are matched by the Martian creatures too, at least in this picture, furthering the idea of the tripods being biological extensions of the aliens themselves. This is probably the most obvious example of Gorey, in my opinion, clearly having taken great inspiration from the album Kahea drawings. Just in general, I feel like the designs are quite similar, but they're also the only two, at least that I can think of right now, that have these very distinct eyes. However, whereas in Kahea's version, the eyes generally seem to be probably the biggest criticism of them. Well, not criticism, but I see a lot of people making fun of them, rather understandably. Gorey, however, I think has done quite a grand job of implementing the eyes into his design, by texturing them with subtle dots, feeling very reminiscent of insects, again adding to that insect feeling these tripods give off, enhancing their creepiness factor, making them seem somehow simultaneously so alive, yet so soulless. It's really quite fascinating how he's done it. Also, I might just be imagining this, but for some reason it slightly looks to me as though the dots in the eyes are loosely arranged in some kind of spiral pattern. It might not be, it might generally just be random dots, but to me they somehow give it a kind of psychotic look. Another reason for the eyes, I feel like, is that via their positioning they're able to play a role in conveying the utter dominance of the Martians over humanity. Nearly all of the fighting machines seem to be shown just looking up and straight ahead, as opposed to down at the humans that they're slaying. Like they're that powerful that they don't even need to look at what they're doing, as if it's just so easy to them, almost automatic. They're able to cause such chaos without even trying, just striding around destroying everything as if it's nothing, like casual predators. That's how totally powerful they are, further emphasised by how gigantic the tripods are shown to be, which is really only seen when you notice the trail of abysmally small people ignited on fire underneath them. But not only that, but just the fact that that's something you have to notice, as opposed to just instantly perceiving it, is indicative of this. You almost have to look at the image for a minute or even longer before even noticing the carnage going on in the corner. Otherwise it kind of looks like quite a peaceful, nice image of a field, but with spider octopus dinner plates. There's not just people on fire, but part of the background is ablaze too. And there's more detail here than you'd expect. You can even make out what seems to be the silhouette of a church, backlit against the fire as well. So clearly this was very deliberate. This wasn't just him trying to suggest destruction by putting some fire in the background. Having such tiny details mapped out, I think shows that Gorey was specifically trying to convey how insignificant human civilization is to the Martians. Like how humans casually walk about outside while barely even realising that they're stepping on ants on the ground. The tripods are the main focus of the picture, and the utter destruction, humans writhing in agony and their villages burning, is simply a tiny little detail you barely even notice at first. Of course, I guess you've got to keep in mind that as a book cover this would have been viewed in 3 separate parts, front, spine and back, and not as one big image as I'm showing it here. But at the same time it is still ultimately designed as one big image just wrapped around a book, so I think this point is still valid. And it's one that I think perfectly backs up one of the main points of the author, with H.G. Wells' attempt to show humans that, although they may think they're the most important species in the universe, above all others, this arrogance may be misplaced. The theme of humanity's insignificance is further stressed by the fact that they and their entire civilization is only shown in silhouettes. Only the Martians are illuminated. Nearly everything else is almost always portrayed in shaded lines and basic designs, utilising simple shapes in stark sketches with great contrast, which again matches perfectly the novel, where there's little characterisation as the characters are generally unimportant to the story and irrelevant compared to the bigger picture of what's going on, this Martian invasion. It's no different in Gorey's pictures. Barely any details are shown on the characters, whereas the Martians are highlighted. Almost remind me of like the Vertigo poster that came out a couple of years before these drawings. I just feel like Gorey uses to great effect shapes in a simplistic style while still having great detail. I don't really know how to describe it, I guess. But I think my favourite example of this is perhaps this one of the Thunderchild sequence. The ship, this almighty symbol of human power, is portrayed as just a tiny little black shape, barely taking up any of the image, while the tripod looms gigantic as part of the background in a triumphant pose, lifting its leg to a far greater height than the ship, almost like it's about to step on it. And the high contrast in this image and harsh lines is spectacular. It's almost like the yin and yang symbol, except it's shown the halves of the Martians and the Earth, except with one side being on top and clearly the dominant one. Although Gorey's depictions aren't quite as explicit as previous artists have been, it doesn't feel like as if this is because he can't, or because the images are too small or anything like that. It feels more like a deliberate choice, because the detail that he does put in is all he needs to in order to evoke the horror of these scenes. Going back to the cover, and there's even more examples of Gorey's attention to detail than I previously spoke about. You've got the trees of the field and the strands of the grass, pretty standard stuff, but then against the background he put in what I'm pretty sure is the planet Mars as just a speck in the background. Completely unnecessarily, but I love that he did this. To me, I think it adds an afterthought of ominousness. You're seeing the destruction of these invaders, and then just unnoticed in the background you see where they've come from, their home planet secretly looming over this scene. This little round red dot is against a very distinctive purple sky. That is probably the most notable thing about this image aside from the tripods. The purple is entirely block colour, interrupted only by what for some reason I've always felt like was black clouds emphasising the horror of this world, but is presumably actually the black smoke emitted from the invaders. Which is perhaps why the sky is purple, to enhance this feeling of the world being intoxicated maybe. It certainly gives the image a very off feeling. I mean, imagine it with a nice beautiful bright blue sky. It wouldn't look so threatening, would it? Retroactively reminds me of the old default Windows desktop wallpaper. So maybe that's why Gorey made the sky purple. I did wonder if the reason that it was used instead of perhaps the more obvious red is so the orange text stands out far better as opposed to blending in. But another theory I thought of is that if red represents the Martians, and of course this is Earth which would normally have a blue sky, well, blue and red make purple, so the purple is basically representing the Martians taking over the planet. These were just my initial thoughts on the matter. However, while making this video I realised it'd probably be a good idea to analyse the novel closer, and I think the cover is likely a direct portrayal of this passage from chapter 7 of book 2. At first I stared unintelligently across the London Valley. The northern hills were shrouded in darkness, the fires near Kensington glowed redly, and now and then an orange-red tongue of flame flashed up and vanished in the deep blue night. And just to interrupt, I just looked up Kensington and the first image that came up on Google Images showed that clearly its most recognisable building has the tall spire as seen on the cover. So continuing on, all the rest of London was black. Then, nearer I perceived a strange light, a pale violet-purple fluorescent glow quivering under the night breeze. For a space I could not understand it, and then I knew that it must be the red weed from which this faint irradiation proceeded. With that realisation, my dormant sense of wonder, my sense of the proportion of things awoke again. I glanced from that to to Mars, red and clear, glowing high in the west, and then gazed long and earnestly at the darkness of Hampstead and Highgate. So clearly I think this was the scene Gorey was depicting on the cover, only making use of around 3 colours, excluding the standard black and white. Again, Gorey doesn't need a lot to make his point and to make a distinct image. This special edition version of The War of the Worlds became out of print, with the only way to get it being old copies for sale online. However, in 2005, after being unavailable for nearly half a century, New York Review Books Classics celebrated Gorey's pictures in a new special hardcover edition to reintroduce modern readers to the story and his illustrations. A depiction that is still fondly remembered today. I first discovered them after reading comments years ago talking about them, and I looked them up and saw the cover and whatever and thought, wow, that's a really weird, creepy design. These tripods are incredibly striking, and it was clear from the comments that Gorey's portrayal to many people was the depiction of the War of the Worlds, the one that they grew up with knowing as the iconic version. And it's clear that today they still garner a great interest. The amount of 3D renders I've seen people do of the Gorey tripods is quite incredible, and understandably so, as they're definitely, in my opinion, I think the most terrifying tripod design that I know of, delving into the horror aspect of the story more than any other, in a way that perfectly matches it. If I didn't know about them and someone showed me these illustrations and said these were the first ever drawings of the War of the Worlds, you could easily imagine this being the case, that these were among the first ever depictions, yet in reality they were done over half a century later. That's how timeless Gorey's pictures are. They have such a classic feeling to them, as if they're as old as the novel itself, which I think says a lot for the style of Edward Gorey, and that's why he was clearly such a great choice to illustrate this 1960s special edition of The War of the Worlds.